Hi there, it's Kevin with RogueDeckBuilder.com with this week's episode of the Market Monday. So this week I'm just going to touch on two things. I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet-ish for a Market Monday, and then we'll have the Market Monday recap over at the Rogue Market channel, which will give a top 10 cards that I think might be either overrated or underrated right now from the competitive standard league finishes. This is the first list that we have available from utilizing cards from Ravnica Allegiance, and there already seems to be a little bit of trends starting to showcase here. Now, let me just tell you exactly how MTGO works for decks that get published on this list. So basically, you have to have, I believe, 10 different cards. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. It might be fewer or a little bit more than 10 to show up on this list, and they'll showcase every deck. They went 5-0. That is the reason why in the tournament before this, there was only one that actually showed up, because there just wasn't enough people running a variety of decks and enough participants. There might have actually been multiple 5-0s in the Boros aggro, and same thing with Pauper this week. Only had 2 finishings, which shows probably there was very few Pauper participants, but it also could mean that just the vast overwhelming number of people that 5-0'd were from 2 of those archetypes, and they were just stock lists. So we do kind of expect this from week 1, a lot of lists that actually showcase, because no one even has a quote-unquote net deck to have that stock list to copy and paste from, and you'll see a little more innovation within these archetypes. So that's kind of like this is where it's the most interesting. We saw this in week number 1 of Guilds of Ravnica, and we saw cards like Isareth, I believe is the card, the Death Touch 3/3 that brings cards back, that showed up in lists, and we haven't seen those since, because people were trying a variety of cards in a slot that it hasn't really won its slot yet. As the meta continues to be formulated, we're going to see some of these cards start to lose their ground, and then we'll start to see those kind of stock or net deck type list showcase, and we can get a better idea of what cards are going to go up and what cards are going to go down. So again, this is the wild west of both the market and the week 1 of standard, which is very, very fun. It's probably the most fun time in Magic, as everything kind of goes here, and no one really faults you for running anything in these particular slots. But again, we already are starting to see some trends from Ravnica, at least the cards that have been Ravnica Allegiance, the cards that have been the most impactful. On the right hand side here are the top cards from, let me zoom in here a little bit here with the you can see these a little bit better. So the top cards from Ravnica Allegiance that did showcase here were the Gruul, the Hydroid Krasis. There are a lot of decks just slotting this card in as mainly a 4-drop or a 6-drop type slot, drawing a card or drawing 2 cards and leaving back a big body. Seems to be pretty good in this format when it's wide open. We have the Gruul Spellbreaker, which is very good against Settle the Wreckage. It's also a very aggressive card, either 3/3 haste or a 4/4 body for 4 mana. Feels like on par with the power level of something like the Steel Leaf Champion, as it does have trample, so it has that pseudo evasion, and the haste is also pretty good. So you have a great turn 1 Llanowar Elf into a Gruul Spellbreaker. Give or take, the haste is more needed, or the 4/4 body. Then we have the Incubation Druid, and Incubation Druid has seen a ton of lists. We'll show later down, but again, this might just be because those particular lists, if we're going into Sultai or even Abzan, anything that runs green, it seems to have the most diverse amount of cards that could be played with like an Incubation Druid type strategy. So I think that this is a little bit overinflated for how the card's performing. We'll have to wait and see. And then last but not least, of course, the most played card from the Ravnica Allegiance was the Growth Chamber Guardian. Now, the interesting thing, though, from Ravnica Allegiance, though, is the set still has a very, very high price tag. So I think that everything across the board is going to go down. Maybe a few mythics can hold their price, because usually you do have a card out of a set that holds a $20 or above mythic price, and that's kind of what we call the chase card that has the value of the set. And in this one, it's just kind of spread down. We had the Hydroid Krasis actually leapfrog the Spawn of Mayhem, and a few of these others. I think Angel of Grace was the most anticipated card, and it actually had a pretty poor showing. I think that Angel of Grace is actually one of the more powerful cards once we do get a tempo deck, and tempo, I think, is really, really well positioned once the control finds its right numbers and starts weeding out these mid-range and aggro decks. It might leave room for Angel of Grace, so keep your eye on this type of card. It could be one of those that crashes and then bounces back up. I typically don't like mythics if they're over like $10-12 to begin with. If you're going to invest in them, I'd like to get into the the good old Arclight Phoenix. You get into it when it's $2 and then it hits back up to $25. When a card is $15 and goes up to 20, that's actually not that great rate of return when you factor in all the cost of labor, the shipping, the fees, and whatnot. We have the Prime Speaker Vanifer also was a very, very anticipated card that did have a 5.0 list, but doesn't have the greatest showing. Where the good stuff really comes from this set is look at how many rares above the $3 mark. This is going to have a lot more to do with the set EV than having high-priced mythics, and there is just at least a dozen of these type of cards. And if we actually look over the lists of these sort of cards, the market was right this time. Most of these cards, if not all of these cards, did see some amount of play in the 5.0 finishes. So let's get back to these 5.0 finishes, and we'll kind of analyze them and talk about where they're going to go forward. So we have the black-red. This is just going to be a black-red, what we call big red type deck that skips the early play and tries to go to the bigger, more sustainable creatures. The Direfleet Daredevil, this was kind of a mainstay in this type of archetype. This is nothing new. I think they're just splashing mainly for Bedevil here, and it does give you access to Duress, and Duress is actually very, very needed in this type of deck because it actually gives you some game versus control. So typically these big reds are good at going over the top of aggro and other mid-range decks with just the sheer value that Rekindling Phoenix and Siege Game Commander, and the Direfleet Daredevil gets to use cards that your opponent played, like Vraska's Contempt, against them, and leaves back a 2/1 body. So yeah, this archetype isn't anything new, but of course the Bedevil looks like it is kind of taken over the slot that a lot of these ones had to run, either more Banefires, definitely more Lava Coils. I'm trying to think of what the other card they used to run for removal. Maybe it's just even Lightning Strike in this slot. And this gives you, the Bedevil gives you access just to kill artifacts, creatures, planeswalkers. Very, very versatile card, instant speed. Perfect for what you need against Vivians and other planeswalkers that typically were able to grind this type of deck out. Still having the treasure map, like I said, this used to be called like Treasure Red before, and it would even run like Experimental Frenzy, but this one just seems like it doesn't really need that continuous card draw for that now that they have ways to finish out the game and control the board better. So the deck of the Bedazzle is interesting. This, I believe, is the only showing of the card. This is actually near bulk rare status. I believe this is one of the least expensive cards. It is the least expensive rare that made a 5.0 finish. So for whatever that's worth, I can't remember if this is in the Ravnica kit or the Ravnica Legion's guild kit or not for Rakdos. Of course, you need to always check that before you invest in cards. However, out of all of the cards that did have a showing, this one is the cheapest one. Target creature gets +3/-3 is probably what they're putting in here, but the Bedazzle does have the ability to instant speed kill, like a Settle or the Search for Azcanta that is flipped, or any other problematic land at that point. Maybe a Primal Amulet that's flipped, those type of things. That flips into a land, right? Yeah, it does. Any of those type of cards, maybe Bedazzle does actually, at late game, you can at least do 2 damage to destroy land. I don't know how much that actually adds to this card, but I think it's just the +3/-3 to get rid of the Adanto Vanguard is really why this card's in here. Other than that, not a lot of new innovation. So this is one you want to definitely keep your eye on. Maybe that +3/-3 is exactly what this format needs to get rid of indestructible cards or instant speed. The thing about it, I don't see any synergy in this particular deck to giving your own creatures the +3/-3. That's kind of a cool angle that can be done if something like a Doom Whisper was in this particular deck. The sideboard also did not have anything new innovation, just the Blood Crypts and the Blood Crypts is the only one. So you have another black-red deck. This is an Aristocrats deck. This is surrounding Judith. Now, when we go over this list, you're going to see a ton of Judith the Scourge Diva, and it is. I've also personally I've brewed a lot with this card, and this card is very, very good in the meta at the moment because it's the perfect card to go underneath other mid-range decks or go over top of other aggro decks or just apply the perfect amount of pressure versus control. So I am on Team Judith here. I think that Judith is the perfect card for these Aristocrats type shell. I hate using the word Aristocrats. For a little bit of history lesson, Aristocrats was coined when I believe there's two as Falconwrath Aristocrat and Cartel Aristocrat were in a deck, and so it utilized off of sacking creatures. And so now when there's ever a deck that sacrifices creatures, it's just the people call it Aristocrat. So I think it's time for an upgrade for the name since they're literally are no aristocrats in this deck, but it's just a black-red sacrifice type deck that has some renewable resources like the Legion War Boss. But other than that, it has some interesting the Footlight Fiend. I'm going to test this card in other builds. I think there's a pretty neat little interaction you can do with Judith and the hero of the 10th district, I think is what it's called, where it creates a 1/1 human every time you cast a multicolored spell, and then just running a bunch of multicolored cards with Judith. There are plenty of Boros cards that get a ton of value with the card. But this one is just trying to utilize the Fireblade Artist as a sack outlet. Gutter Bones can come back. There's a neat little interaction with the Fireblade Artist and Gutter Bones. It's renewable 2 damage per turn for 2 mana. The Footlight Fiend's also something that's kind of cool to get that damage to then be able to cast the Spawn of Mayhem. And a good 4/4 for 3 mana that if your opponent is or if you have less than 10 life, you put a +1 counter on it, so it gets bigger and bigger against those type of mirror and can easily close out the game. Still has the cards like Ravenous Chupacabra. So this one tries to play more of an Aristocrats type mid-range. This list is, if this is what you expect from week 1. It's not very defined on the numbers. It's running a lot of random stuff like a 1 of Viashino Pyromancer, 3 Skewer the Critics, 3 Lightning Strikes, 2 Angress. I'm thinking this is going to get more streamlined as time goes on and people start to figure out the cards that work the best with Judith and what curve works the best. So you'll see a lot of Judith decks, a lot of people's takes with Judith and what that shows me is the power level of this card is really, really where it needs to be to compete in this format. So that's a good news for Ravnica Allegiance. I believe this is the most expensive rare next to a couple of the shock lands. It has been going up. And it isn't usually legendary creatures have a tough time doing that, but this is one that is run in multiples. If we look over the sideboard, there's not a lot of innovation here from Ravnica. It's just now we finally have the good lands for the Rakdos, which I think, Orzhov, Rakdos, and Simic for sure. That's all they were missing for them to be competitive in the environment. All right, so now we got this very interesting list here by the Weather Report. I love this innovation from this particular deck. This is running status to statue, and I'm thinking that they're running status to statue because it has synergy with both Goblin Chain Whirler and Siege King Commander. So this is one of those go big red decks. So rather than go under the radar, it's just trying to go big with all these. Direfleet Daredevil again, the Rixmati Reveler, which can help fix the hand early if you get Spectacle online. It is a great little card advantage late game, and so this card never feels bad. Goblin Chain Whirler is still, of course, really good in the format with tokens and other things. And then when you pair it with status to statue to give it Death Touch, it's a board wipe. So it's a 4 mana board wipe. And a statue is also not that unreasonable to cast for 4 mana in this type of format. If people are going bigger, you don't need that early removal, and the statue is right on par with taking care of a threat equal to the mana cost that you pump into it. So really, really like this innovation. In fact, I think there's a lot to do with the status to statue. In fact, status to statue looks pretty cool with Judith. To give Judith Death Touch and then start sacking a bunch of creatures and then pinging down your opponent's stuff. This is a fine finality deck. I've actually ran a similar type of list of Rakdos list that just splashes for the fine finality, and it does pretty good. Again, it's something in the right meta that this type of deck can compete with plenty of tier decks. It does have a little bit of trouble, I think, against control decks, but again, against other mid-range decks, you can definitely see where this can go over the top and have some cool little combos. Definitely, I think this deck is very much geared to beating up the Phoenix decks, which, mind you, we saw a whopping 0 Phoenix decks list show up in week 1. And again, I think that maybe people are bored with it. A lot of people are just trying to innovate, but usually there's the people that are still going to take the oldest archetypes and try to see how well they do in the new field. And so it just shows that the Phoenix decks did not do very well in this new field. All right, so speaking of an old deck, we had the Boros Weenie. This was another deck that had, I believe, no innovation. This is just the stock list that existed before. We didn't get a lot of 1-drops that are worthy, I don't think, but there are definitely some 2-drops from Ravnica Allegiance that I think could end up going in this deck. Again, there was none. Still shows that a Johnny Adversary of Tyrants, I believe there's another list that had a Johnny in here, is pretty good. I still like this card. I don't know if there's any amount of time left in the market for Johnny to go up in value. We have challenger decks coming out, and I think that mono white is looking to be definitely one of those that they're going to throw in challenger decks, and I think a Johnny will be in that deck. So otherwise, I would invest in this card. However, there's not enough time for it to accrue any sort of value. Tocatli Honor Guard's another card that still looks interesting to me. Before this new season, this new Ravnica Legions came out, Tocatli Honor Guard was the third most played creature in the format. A lot of it was in the sideboard, and it is pretty much it's lost its $3 to $2 value. You can find copies of this for as low as 85 cents. I think that certain vendors were selling them for 75, 85 cents. And there are still a ton of Enter the Battlefield triggers that the Tocatli Honor Guard shuts down. As you can look back at a bunch of these decks, look like the Siege Gang Commander, the Goblin Chainwhirler, the Rix Maadi Reveler, the Direfleet Daredevil. Tocatli Honor Guard solves all of it from the deck right above it. And there are plenty of decks through this list, especially that Hydra, that the Tocatli Honor Guard shuts down at least the Enter the Battlefield part of Claws of the Creatures. So now we have another kind of stock list that doesn't really have a lot of innovation, but we have the Golgari midrange splashing blue, basically for Negate in the sideboard and Hydroid Krasis in the main. We're going to see a lot of Golgari decks, in my opinion, start to do this, because one of the glaring holes in the Golgari midrange strategy has been the Teferi decks. If you can throw some protection through the cards like Negate, I could even see the now why can't I think of the Thought Erasure? I think that is a pretty good sideboard card just to chuck in, and it doesn't really hurt the mana base too much in an Explore type deck. And Hydroid Krasis does seem to play very similar. The card that got banned, the 3/2 add 2 energy, was it the Renegade? Now I can't think of the card that was banned out from Kaladesh. And we saw Sultai decks back then basically just splashing for that. You might actually see Hostage Takers start to come in this slot too, in maybe with Ravenous Chupacabra or instead of Ravenous Chupacabra. I think that beforehand the mana wasn't perfect, and now we do have perfect mana where you can literally just use both the green lands that have the other color, and it won't hurt your mana whatsoever. So Overgrown Tomb and the breeding pool, and you can still cast your cards on curve. So I do think the Golgari is going to start going more towards Sultai. We saw that trend with Kaladesh later on, that there is no reason not to. The energy decks, start to bring in blue. There are the Muldratha looks kind of interesting in a deck like this as a one of. Maybe we can start to get that sort of innovation. Any sort of blue card that can splash in this particular list, I think we're going to start seeing more numbers of. That's what I like about this format, though. It's going to really widen your options, because beforehand, without perfect mana, you had to kind of stick to the Ravnica. The Guilds of Ravnica guilds. Now when we have perfect mana, you can go on to all the shards. You can go on to mix and match, splash one card from one different color pairing and be just fine. So I kind of like this innovation with the Hydroid Krasis. Works very well with Fine Finality to get it back after it has been used, and can get you a lot of card advantage through the Hydroid Krasis. The Vivian Reed seems to be alive and well. But other than that, this is just an entire stock list, with the exception of the Cry of the Carnarium being the replacement for the now defunct the Golden. I can't remember the card. -2/2 from Rivals of Ixalan, which is kind of funny. I wonder if people will start to run Golden Demise. Split of these or not, because sometimes Golden Demise was a huge blowout when you did have the City's Blessing and it didn't affect you. Alrighty, so we go on to the Mono Blue Temple. This is another deck that did not have a lot of innovation. This was, I think the only cards was Essence Captures in the sideboard, which are very, very good if you're going against creature-based decks. I suggest, personally, 2 changes to the deck. I have played this deck in some matches on Arena. I know people can chuckle at that, but I did actually 7-2 a quick queue with the Mono Blue Tempo. Played basically against everything, and it was this deck was just pure gas now with the new cards that we get. One is the Terra Mandor. Terra Mandor is currently a 50-cent uncommon, and if it does actually slot in this particular list, these are the type of uncommons that can go up quite significantly, because this is a very, very budget deck at $5.88. It's easy to build this deck, and it's very competitive. So I like the Terra Mandor, and I also like the Sphinx that allows you to scry on turn 3. Being able to keep bad one land hands because you can scry 3 is huge. And it also seemed to be quite on a 4/4 flyer for 4 with a deck that can run anywhere from 20 to 18 lands. Seems to be exactly what you want for another finisher with Tempest. I don't really personally like the Warkite Marauder. However, to each his own. If people do like the Warquiet Marauder, there are definitely some matchups where this card's good. But that's what I slotted in. Just took out the Warquiet Marauder, took out the Mystical Herald, added those two, put Essence Captures in the main, and very similar to this list, and the Terra Mandor gets pumped up very easily if you go a little bit heavier on the spells and lower on the lands, lower on the creature counts. The Terra Mandor can be flipped over to a 5/5 quite quickly, and the card's for real. I'll have to show you that list going forward. So again, I think this deck's still alive and well, though. I think they'll continue to trickle up. We should be selling out a standard soon, though. Usually February, March is the latest I'll give standard. After that, everything just has its natural free fall as vendors year after year seem to start earlier and earlier getting out of standard. This one is, though, a very, very, if this continues to be a very vibrant meta or a very vibrant metagame, with a lot of different decks, you can see that standard as a whole could hold its price for typically longer than standards of the past. But if you're looking towards the future, I get it. Come February, I would get rid of everything from the core 2019 all the way to Ixalan in preparation for rotation. So Mono Red is still alive and well. This is the exact same list. I don't think there's anything new to this except for Light Up the Stage and Skewer the Critics, which I think are just adding more options to an already perfect deck. This deck, it's going to be hard to make this deck much better with the options that come out with ladder sets, because it's doing exactly what Mono Red does. It's very, very quick. Like I said, it's going to be hard to get over a power level with something like Bioshino Pyromancer that gets you Lava Runner. The Skewer the Critics, though, I think is still leaning towards being less than Wizard's Lightning, because you can get the discount easier with the Wizards. And the one thing about Skewer the Critics, which I found in the pre-release, is when I kept looking at this card and realized it's sorcery, not instant. I think that is a little bit of a deal with this deck. What I like about this little innovation from this deck is Light Up the Stage is replacing basically Flame of Keld and Risk Factor. So keep that in mind. If people start going away from Risk Factor because Light Up the Stage is more reliable than both the Flame of Keld and Risk Factor, those are two targets you can get rid of. Just dump them going forward. Even post-rotation, post-rotation, this deck still looks pretty good as far as to continually generate value with Experimental Frenzy, Risk Factor, and Light Up the Stage. So it seems like Red Deck Wins is going to be around for a long time in Standard, at least until the Ravnica sets rotate. All right, so we go down to the red-green. Now, this is where we're starting to see more of the innovation. So I've been proven wrong with the Skargan Hellkite. This is a card I was very disappointed in. It's another card that does work with that status to statue, by the way. So if you're looking at Jund lists, here's another one you should definitely think about if you're going to run that combo. But this is going to be a Growth Chamber. This Growth Chamber is the most played card from Ravnica Allegiance, and it's just because it does exactly what these green-red mid-range want. It gives you value, gives you a threat early that you can adapt later on to a 4/4 threat, and then it replaces itself. So it's card draw. It's a nice body with a relatively low investment in the card. So Rekindling Phoenix deck, again, we've seen Rekindling Phoenix hit a ton of these lists. I believe that Rekindling Phoenix is at a very, very low. I think a lot of this was just due to the shift of a lot of Drake decks running around, and Rekindling Phoenix was getting hit with lava coils. If we're seeing a lack of lava coils instead of the wreckages, and now red-green does have an answer towards the wreckage, I think Rekindling Phoenix could rekindle itself, pun intended there, and go back up to the $30 mark. If that is the case, though, I highly, highly suggest you do get out of these Rekindling Phoenixes as soon as possible, as there won't be enough time for them to really accrue a lot of value. So if we do see a price spike, which I do expect, I'm assuming we're going to see price spikes very similar to the Guilds of Ravnica, to when the meta kind of became stale or known here. And so last time around, we saw the Rekindling Phoenix go from 22 to 35. We could definitely see the same thing happen. The thing is, though, that I have seen that vendors are very saturated with this card. When you have Channel Fireball and Card Kingdom selling at relatively low comparatively to the market price on TSG Player, that's something that's not going good for the Rekindling Phoenix. However, we're also seeing both the Jade Light Ranger, the Merfolk Branchwalker, so this is that type of shell. And like I said, the Gruul Spellbreaker gives that added protection against the wreckage. Might be enough for these cards to really compete against those control decks. The Zertog Goblin being a 2/2 haster, a 3/3/2, it has been slotted into this slot. I think that is what makes a deck be able to really compete against control and not as having a 3-powered card on turn number 2. Shock, Lightning Strike, nothing else kind of new here. We do have the Vivian Reed's in the sideboard and a Rhythm of the Wild in the sideboard as a one-of. And this is a card that you'll see in multiples in many decks. I think that people haven't even really found the full power level of this card quite yet. And everything else is pretty normal. Cindervine's a 4-of too. That seems to be a very good card against Turbo Fog and Control. And it seems like Gruul is very, very represented. We'll see the next decks will have a huge Gruul theme to it. On to another red-green list, which is the Growth Chamber list, is another Gruul Spellbreaker Growth Chamber list. Zertog Goblin, same sort of shell, but this one's running Pelt Collector. I think Pelt Collector actually has a really, really good synergy with this deck, as it's going to get big off the Kroll Harpooner, and it's also going to get big off of the Zertog Goblin because it will enter with that 3/3, so it can go to a 2/2 and a 3/3 quite easily. And we also have the Llanowar Elves to ramp into the Gruul Spellbreaker. I'm surprised that this list did not want to use a Steel Leaf Champion. I think Steel Leaf Champion will easily go in this list. I think it could go easier on the mana base. Maybe you wouldn't want to splash the Rekindling Phoenix. And if you really want to go on a Pelt Collector, though, it definitely seems viable at the moment to kind of have the Pelt Collector into the these cards with 4 and 5 power, and you extract with the Nullhide Ferrex, you can get to a 6. You can even see like Galta in these type of lists too. Galta seems pretty interesting also with the Rhythm of the Wild as another way to give it haste and really just close out that game. So again, I think that we're going to see a lot of different decks, different what's the saying, different strokes for different folks type cards that just meet different needs. And again, the meta is so wide open that there will be reasons, at least justifiable reasons, for running one card over another at any given time. This one does have Llanowar Elves and a Legion Warboss, little angle that I really like as well. The sideboard too has Vivian Reed. Vivian Reed's still there. I expect Vivian Reed numbers to go back up when the format starts to settle in. We're back to week 1 where there's very little Vraska's Contempts and Vivian Reeds, and as the weeks progress, it seems like more people just keep adding more and more of those particular cards because they're so good in the meta. This also has Cindervines in the sideboard, as well as Banefire. Another red-green deck. This one's another Pelt Collector, and there we go. There's the Steel Leaf Champion. So this one's going right off the Llanowar Elves into the Gruul Spellbreaker or the Steel Leaf Champion, then into the Nullhide Ferox, and then into Galta. So this is kind of funny. This one doesn't use the Rhythm of the Wilds. I think Llanowar Elves and the Rhythm of the Wilds is also a pretty solid play, even if you have a bunch of cards in your hand, because it's not really hurting your curve too much if you can rely on giving your cards haste. I mean, they're getting in for their natural damage anyway with a Rhythm out. So that's what I'd like to see from this particular deck, is chucking those in, maybe down on some of these numbers. Really get some value. I do like this list a lot. This one going with the Thorn Lieutenant over the Growth Chamber Guardian. So that's interesting there. And also this one has Collision to Colossus, which is kind of cool. The +4/+2 and Trample, I think, is a very versatile, being able to get rid of removal. Collision, of course, very good against the Drakes, the Phoenix, the Nimizet type cards. There seem to be a lot of them. I think Orzhov has that card where it makes a player sacrifice a creature, which is also and gaining life equal to the power is also keeping the Phoenix deck a little bit at bay at the moment. But sideboard, nothing really new as far as innovation. It just seems that Gruul is exactly what the mono green list needed to really go over the top. A lot of times mono green just couldn't close out that last bit of damage. But when you have cards like Thud, and if you can give it haste through the Rhythm of the Wild, I think that's exactly what these decks wanted, and now Gruul is here to stay. We have some Selesnya tokens innovation with the Growth Chamber Guardian. I don't know how well I like it in this slot. Is it where Selesnya wants to be? Who knows? I think the people have ran Thorn Lieutenant in this slot as well, so I guess that's justifiable. And this is also running the Incubation Druid. I think this is kind of weirdest place for it. It can get +1/+1 counters from a Johnny, so it's got that kind of cool interaction, and as well as Venerated Loxodon. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know how I like that. I think I like another way to put a +1 counter on it. But yeah. So here's the Incubation Growth Chamber. You'll see this combo, this little duel happen a lot. We still have a Mara. We still have Drostani, Venerated Loxodon in this little pack here. And the March of Multitudes, Flower Flourish. Yep, this is a kind of a stock list with some new innovation. Unbreakable Formation in the sideboard. This is also one of the cards that has been trending down that I think that people haven't found the true power level of this card yet. Knight of Autumn is another card that seems to be put in a lot of decks lately. Keep your eye on the price of Knight of Autumn. As far as the standard, it already does see play in modern. If standard actually does add towards the demand, this card could go up. The Nullhide Feryx, too, you'll notice this card is seeing a lot of lists with the Nullhide Feryx. Again, I think that mono-green decks, the traditional mono-green stock list now, either can go into Simic and they can go into Gruul. Both of those color combinations seem to pair a little bit better than mono-green wanted to be with like the Golgari. Golgari likes to go on that more explore route, the more grind you out route. And Celestia, same thing. I think the mono-green works better with the Gruul. The splashes work better with Simic and Gruul rather than the ones that existed beforehand. This is going to be another list. This looks very similar to kind of the Golgari list. This one's running the Biogenic Ooze. Typically, I don't know if Biogenic Ooze actually is better than the one that pumps out Saprolings. If you do have a lot of mana, you can create a lot of oozes, but I still think the Sapling one, and you do leave back 2/2 bodies rather than 1/1 bodies if it does die, and they will immediately become 3/3s in a turn. I'll have to test this card out. Turn 1, if it's not dealt with, that it comes out, it's going to leave 2 3/3 bodies back. If it is killed, it's going to have a 2/2 back. And then each turn that this survives, of course, the oozes are going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Vivian Reed still seems to be in these type of decks. This one's also running a growth spiral as the blue with the Hydroid Krasis to just kind of get ahead of the curve and start casting some of these bigger cards. Still Fine Finality, one in the main, one in the side. Carnage Tyrant still there in the side. We even have a Mesmerizing Bantha. This one just seems like a list that they just threw a bunch of cards and tried them out to see how well they did. We do have the Hadana's Climb and the Incubation Druid / the Growth Chamber Druid combo. You're going to see this sort of combo show up a lot with Hadana's Climb. Hadana's Climb has been increasing in value up to, up to $6 now. In my opinion, it's probably the right time to sell. I don't see this in a lot of numbers. It's kind of awkward most of the time with this particular deck. And it's gonna be really flashy when it works, but there's gonna be a lot of times when it's not gonna really do much. That's my 2 cents on that sort of interaction. We see another one of these Sultai lists that this one is running Hostage Taker over the Ravenous Chupacabra and Zagana Utopia Speaker. What's really cool about Zagana is it works very well with the Merfolk Branchwalker and the Jadelight Ranger to draw a card. So you have a 4/4 body, and you draw a card, and creatures with +1/+1 counter get trample. So again, that's the Jadelight Ranger, and then you can actually make this into an 8/8 trampler later on. So I do like Zagana. At first, I wasn't liking Zagana, but now when you actually pair it with Ixalan cards that enter the battlefield with +1 encounters a lot easier than a lot of the Simic cards that came out of Ravnica Allegiance. This card does seem like a very, very powerful card. This is another card that is very undervalued, but I do believe this is in the Ravnica Allegiance Guild kit. So it does have that kind of bar that it's able to hit before it doesn't make sense to go up anymore based on just the amount of supply that's being entered in from the Ravnica Allegiance. Hadana's Climb is a 3 of in this deck as well to put on those counters, the Incubation Druid and the Growth Chamber Guardian. It's a really, really good interaction with going, especially if you go like turn 2 Incubation Druid and turn 3 Hadana's Climb, put some counters, and then immediately you use the Incubation Druid to get a Jadelight Ranger, for example. The next turn you have a card with potentially 2 counters on it that can get flipped. Isn't it 3 with the with the Hadana's Climb? And you could be swinging in for lethal quite quickly. So now we just have a blue-green list, the same sort of Hadana's Climb, Growth Chamber Guardian, Incubation Druid combo with the Hydroid Krasis, Wildgrowth Walker, Jadelight Ranger, Vivian Reed. So it's kind of dropping black for this more of a punch. We also have the Incubation, the Incongruity, which is kind of neat because at this point, who cares about a 3/3 Frog Lizard token when your creature is going to be a little bit bigger with the Hadana's Climb type cards or Hydroid Krasis going over the top. Mass Manipulation in the sideboard, that's kind of funny, kind of cool with the Incubation Druid. Easily able to produce enough mana to make mass manipulation actually viable. So I do like these little Hadana's Climb decks. Maybe now I'm looking at it now with 4 in a row. Maybe Hadana's Climb is the real deal and can continue to go up. Here's another green list that's more of the mono green list that's dropping the black and going into blue. Llanowar Elves, Pelt Collector, Elvish Clan Caller, making your elves bigger because there's a lot of elves here because we have an elf crab wizard and an elf druid and the Thorn Lieutenant. So this is almost like the elf ball. With Steel Leaf Champion, and we have Hadana's Climb and Zagana. This one isn't running the Krasis, though. It's running Spell Pierce and Incubation to Incongruity, Vivian in the main and Vivian in the side, with River's Rebuke in the sideboard, that's actually pretty cool innovation with green. It's just a blowout versus other mid-range base decks, and yeah, Frilled Mystic, too. In the sideboard. Really, really liking this list. Frilled Mystic is not a merfolk. It is an elf. So keep that in mind with elves. I think we are due for a good elf ball strategy too with the big pig that gives everything +2/+2 and trample. I think that's going to be a neat little innovation when people get to it. We have yet another mono green list with the Growth Chamber and the Incubation Druid. This one not running the Hadana's Climb, so it works without it, works with it. And this one is running the Elf Ball strategy with the Marwyn the Nurturer and the Beast Whisperer. So I would like to see people try out the big pig to give everything the buff. I believe it's an 8-drop, kind of the wannabe creator of Behemoth. This is going all in on a lot of the mana producing cards, the Druid and the Llanowar Elves. I'm surprised this one doesn't run the Elvish Clan Caller, as it does seem like it has synergy with the Marwyn. But yep, just try to Elf Ball out and eventually swing in with some big creatures. The Stony Strength is kind of cool. Instant speed +1/+1. Untap a creature. Has that juicy synergy with Marwyn or just pumping up the rest of your cards. Kind of cool just to put on a Growth Chamber and you go immediately search. So it's the adapt is basically half there or less than half. It's 1/3 to adapt it to then go get another one. So neat little list there. Okay, so now we're on it to a 3-colored list. It was very easy to go a blue and a green. This one's only really splashing the blue again for the negates, the Spell Pierces, and the Hydroid Krasis. So the parallel of the Hydroid must be there. I was very disappointed with Hydroid in the pre-release. It was kind of weak. But of course in Standard, when you compare it with the Incubation Druid, I think it has a lot more synergy. This one's trying to kind of combine the two lists that we're looking. So it's the mono green and the Gruul lists together. And we have Ravager Worm showcasing 3 ofs in here, again with the Hellkite. And this one is a Domri list, the first and only Domri list we've seen. Scorch Mark in the sideboard and whatnot. We go on to another of the I can't think of the shard name from the Khan's clan name. Temur. Another Temur list here with the Prime Spirit of Vannifar being in the pod list. So it's making use of like the Sailor of Means, putting back a body early to be then sacrificed to go get a 4-drop. Then the 4-drop Rekindling Phoenix can be sacrificed to go get a 5-drop. So I really kind of like this Prime Speaker of Vannifar and Rekindling Phoenix. Seems like a pretty cool little combination. And then go get a Siege Gang Commander, then go get a Dream Eater, and then eventually go get a Plaka Worm. So Avenger's Impulse and Rhythm of the Wild to give them haste, so the Prime Speaker Vannifar can actually be used the turn it came out. We also have the Rhythm of the Wild that has some cool interactions with the Incubation Druid and the both these Llanowar Elves, as they can tap the turn they come into play or put a counter on it. If you have 2 Rhythm of the Wilds, for example, the Incubation Druid can come into play with a +1 counter and be able to tap. So I kind of like this sweet little list. This one is going to be a creature list, fog-based, going around Wilderness Reclamation. This is a card they're going to have to keep their eye on with the Nexus of Fate, because it's just ridiculous with Nexus of Fate. And then putting on the enchantment to tap for extra mana. You can get tons of mana out of those lands. This one's just trying to run a Murmuring Mystic, eventually find the expansion for Explosion, big expansion for Explosion, so you can like Fog and Expansion Explosion on the same turn quite easily. Growth Spiral to get more lands. Yeah, we've seen this with Teferi. Sideboard brings in Nimbuzet. I think this sort of archetype is here to stay. And we have another Temur list that is again trying to go kind of just a spread of cards. The Jadelight Ranger, the Gruul. See, here's where I like to see Zagana. I think this is where Zagana gets the most bang for its buck because it's both the Gruul Spellbreaker, both of the Explore cards. You have the Incubation Druid, the Hydros Crisis, the Growth Chamber Guardian. All these work very well with Hadana to then be utilized to be a 4/4 that draws a card, which seems to be exactly where this format wants to be. So it looks like that these mid-range decks are playing this big tempo route where they're competing with each other. Then we have this looks like an Abzan list with this reminds me of going back into like the good old Gideon decks, Elspeth and Gideon decks. So it's really trying to stall out till you get a Planeswalker to take over the game. We have Vraska Golgari Queen and Vraska Relic Seeker. Actually, that's only 5 Planeswalkers. History Banality to clog the board, Find Finality, Mortify, Cast Down, Revival to Revenge. Kind of neat little card in this deck. We have the Concentrate to Consume. So it's just trying to be the typical Abzan good stuff deck. We have Midnight Reapers to draw card advantage and trade early on. The Auras of Enforcer leaves back a Death Toucher. The Dust Legion Zealot blocks and draws you a card, possibly gets some value off of the Midnight Reaper. And the Seraph of the Scales also leaves back some cards and has some nice little curve synergy with Lyra Dawnbreaker. So again, this is where this format's at the moment. Is very, very mid-range at the moment. This is another Aristocrats list that is running Alanda. So this is a Mardu one and Midnight Reaper with Judith. The Priest of Forgotten Gods, too, if it can untap and actually sacrifice 2 creatures, can get a lot of value. And we also have the Pitiless Pontiff. So this one is actually, this is the sack outlet rather than the beginning of your upkeep one. And then this is the Hero of Precinct 1, one of my favorite cards out of the Guilds of Ravnica, which allows you to cast a multicolored spell. You get a 1/1 white human creature token, so more fuel for your Priest of the Forgotten Gods. You're casting a lot of multicolored cards, the Footlight Fiends. I'd like to see a little more multicolored cards to really utilize this, but I wonder if Heroic Reinforcements would actually do good in this particular list, or if you have to go even heavier on that. The Theater of Hoarders, the Carnival of Carnage, even showcasing this deck, and Mortify. So we have a nice little Aristocrats list, and one more with the Judith, Scourge of Diva. This one running Tide Taker and Boros Challenger, and then your typical 1-drops from the so Dauntless Bodyguard, Fanatical Firebrand, Healer's Hawks, Hunted Windus, and Heroic Reinforcement. So this is the good old mono white that is saying that Judith is worthwhile to splash black, not only black but red for. I mean, I guess Heroic Reinforcements was with this, but go heavier on red and get that Judith out. And even if they wipe the board, a lot of times that'll be enough. You've pushed through enough damage to where it will be lethal. On to another. This one being a Nihilist with Vivian Reed, Skargan Hellkite, Rekindling Phoenix Aurelia, Night of the Autumn. So they're really just splashing for Aurelia and Night of Autumn for the white. And yeah, nothing in the sideboard either. So another typical list, we're starting to see a lot of these trends of what cards are actually doing good. We actually do have Esper control lists that are viable here, with Kaya's Wrath now being... Actually, they're running it instead of Cleansing Nova, and that's something that I've realized too. The Cleansing Nova a lot of times was just too late, being on 5. If it was 4, it's very good. 5, it's just too late. And other than that, though, this is the typical list that has existed before, with the addition of adding Mortify over Vraska's Contempt, it looks like. So I don't know how well that's going to play out, but yeah. This is another card I think that Warrant to Warden, we're going to see more copies of as time goes on, but it also does get showcased in this particular list. This is a treasure map list here. Teferi Karn, we've seen this a bazillion times. And then we have another Teferi list that is utilizing Absorb as a 4-of rather than the Surveil. And Kaya's Wrath again, replacing the Cleansing Nova. Vraska's Contempt being used over Mortify. Nope, a little combination of the two in this one. And yep, just your typical Esper control. Warrant of Warden is a 4-of in this particular list, and the Search for Azcanta. And then we also have another one, very, very heavy on the control this time, running Ritual Soot over the Kaya one, Kaya's Wrath. That's interesting. And running Precognitive Perception over, in addition to Chemist's Insight. So a lot of these, it looks like Esper Control does work really well. Here's one with Hero Precinct 1 that is using Hero Precinct 1 to really either tempo out the game to give you enough chump blockers or just take over the game. So it feels very similar to Young Pyromancer in this sort of archetype. When you get a trigger off Absorb and Thought Erasure and Mortify and Discovery Dispersal and Warrant to Warden. Really like this list. 3 Karns, 3 Teferis, even have Thief of Sanity and Hostage Taker, so your opponent does have to leave in the creature removal, or the heroes are just going to take over. You're ripping the hand out, you're countering, you're destroying. Pretty nifty little list here. A very flexible sideboard. And then we have the last but not least, we have the another green-blue list that is splashing for a Johnny, Adversary of Tyrants and Deputy of Detention. So this is trying to get the counters via the Johnny, Adversary of Tyrants onto the Incubation. And we even have a Hadana's Climb in here and a Growth Spiral. So it does seem like it's a Wild Wild West for Standard. So what this makes me seem is that the decks can be broken up into mainly Judith decks, the Hadana's Climb decks into the Incubation Druid and Growth Chamber Guardian, Hydroid Krasis in that list, and then Teferi decks. So those would be the big breakout decks that I think we're seeing the most of. I put Gruul in that list too, but I think that, so the Spellbreaker. Did see a lot of the existing archetypes still doing okay, though. We saw some mono whites. We saw red deck wins. The only thing we didn't see that was a mainstay of the format was the Drakes. So apparently whatever's been added from Ravnica Allegiance, whether it just be the sheer power of midrange, the Drakes are just having a tough time keeping up with not only the pressure, but also just the mass amount of advantage that those decks can run. So last but not least, I want to touch on, I know I said this is going to be a short video we'll do a more in-depth of what cards I think are going to go up, but I think this hopes to give you an idea of what cards did outperform other cards, and you can invest accordingly. Last but not least, we will talk about the Ironworks deck. If we look over the Ironworks, the Crackling Ironworks was banned, so therefore, of course, this is going to shake up the meta. In Modern, I think the Modern, it's going to make a little bit some of the slower decks, the control decks, a little more viable, as Underworld combo could go definitely required a lot of hate, like Stony Silence, to take care of. So most of these cards, though, when a deck does get banned, there will be cards that will go down. I don't think there's a lot of cards that looking over this list that don't see play elsewhere. There are a couple that I do think that if you can unload them, it might be smart. Other than they do see a lot of play in other decks, and there will be a breakout deck, I'm sure, in the future that will utilize them. The first one that sees no other play is Scrap Trawler. Scrap Trawler is great in Commander, but this is the only Modern deck, this is the only competitive deck that is currently seeing play in to work off of the Crackling Ironworks, and without Crackling Ironworks, I just don't see this deck or this card being able to retain its value, even though it's not really going for much to begin with because it was a buy a box promo. The other one is Grove of the Burn Willows. We see Grove of the Burn Willows every once in a while in like Living End decks, and a few other decks that don't care about the life that they're giving your opponent. They'd rather that your opponent gains life than damage being dealt. So they play these over shock lands, fetch lands, and whatnot. The Crackling Ironworks, though, was the big reason that Growth of the Burn Willows had a little bit of a resurgence in price from $11 to the $14. So I think that with the amount of Iconic Masters that still is out there, with decks that Grove of the Burn Willows that traditionally went in, like the green-red Tron, haven't really been seen in a while. Amulet Titan, it's an option. A lot of times they don't even run it. And again, Kiki Evolution, same thing. It's just an option. And when it's just an option in a deck, there's not a lot of demand to support it. So I think selling your Grove of the Burn Willows is probably smart right now. That would be the one I'd get out of from the Ironworks combo. And Mindstone 2 is a card that I was slowly like putting some, at least getting these out of bulk for sure. But when I could find them for 10 cents, I'd scoop them up. This is also a card I'm going to turn off the pressure on actually acquiring these, as this was the main force behind this card really going back up. And this is a Commander mainstay. It does get printed a lot, but it's just going to stay stagnant now at this little price tag, maybe even keep going down unless we see another deck in Modern actually start to utilize it. So other than that, though, most of these cards either have no value to begin with, or there's still plenty of play, like the Engineered Explosives, the Mox Opal, the Ancient Stirrings. There are a lot of decks, in fact, with Crackling Ironworks out of the mix. Some of these decks, like the Tron decks, get a lot better to begin with, so it actually might bring some demand to Ancient Stirrings and the Chromatic Stars, because Tron is now has one less, horrid matchup to play against. So that's kind of my overview for week number 1. I'll give you a more concise breakdown. Now we went almost 50 minutes today for the Market Monday recap of cards that I think are going to go up from mainly Ravnica Allegiance, or possibly even go down. We'll just do our typical top 10 list over at the Rogue Market. So be looking forward to the Rogue Market being revived. Things have started to settle down in my life, and I can get to brewing decks for this channel and keep on top of the market type channel. So we also will have another sale coming up for cards. I'm looking into a platform to actually sell cards better than TCG Player. I might just have to bite the bullet and get Crystal Commerce. I've been in talks with some developers too that maybe we can have some sort of rival. I refuse to use TCG Player. It's just an awful format or awful platform for people actually trying to sell cards at a decent margin. And so for funding our store, and so funding some other projects like my buddy's roof and whatnot, we've been doing it just a selling cards, the difference between the market price and buy list price. So be looking for another list if you're willing, if you want to support the Rogue Deck Builder channel, as well as help us dig out of some of those. I gave my friend a loan. I think we've sold enough cards to at least pay me back, but we still have a ways to go to fully funding the roof and some other the products. Like we said, we need to get going. So we'll have a list of cards we still have for sale coming up shortly, and we'll be adding to more cards. And we hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Kevin with the Rogue Deck Builder. Thanks for watching.